Coming up on this week's FAS TV, we are with Ian Cornforth from NatureScot to discuss the importance of bats and how farms can provide the ideal habitat for these mammals. Bats are an endangered species in Scotland, with there being 10 species which can all be found using farmland if the conditions are right for them.
Bats in Scotland, there's probably about 10 species. We're in the south of Scotland, Ayrshire, Dumfries, probably about 10. As you go further north, it gets colder, seasons get harsher, less insects around. So up in the north of Scotland, probably about 2, maybe 1 species. So they're very dependent on the habitat, but mostly in Scotland you're looking at central belt, maybe 5 to 6 species. So bats are mammals. They've got an absolute unique life cycle in that they spend over half the year, or about half the year, hibernating. So if you think about winters in Scotland, and that's not hard to do because they seem to be every day, then it's cold, there's no food available for bats, so bats have to find a way of surviving that, and they shut down. So during the winter, November through to March, they find a cool, damp place, not freezing but cold. They hibernate, sleep during that winter period. During the spring and summer, when there's plenty of insects, they're out and about feeding. So from April through to October, bats will be on the wing. During the summer, the females will give birth, and the interesting thing about the bats is the females will become pregnant before they hibernate. So they'll mate with the males. Pregnancy happens, but doesn't happen at the same time, so the females become pregnant without the babies developing, and then the coming spring, the females give birth, having slept through hopefully the whole of the winter without any food. So it's an incredibly complex lifestyle. They're only in insects in Scotland, as they do in most of Europe, and so they're dependent on that food source being available. So they need high quality habitats to find the insects, high quality habitats to roost and hibernate in. So bats are widely known as bioindicators, and that means that they indicate good biological or habitat health. So in order to have your top predators, tigers, killer whales or bats, everything needs to be in position. Needs to be plenty of prey species, insects, needs to be plenty of habitat to support the prey species, in this case insects. So the fact that you have bats in your farm or in the general landscape is a good indicator that the general habitat is of very good quality. And bats, swallows, swifts, they're all good bioindicators of a healthy functioning ecosystem.
Farm buildings can provide a perfect place for bats to hibernate during the winter months, and for females a maternity roost, a place to give birth and raise their young. Farm buildings can offer different conditions which allows a variety of bat species to set up a roosting site.
So bats are creatures of the night, and in terms of where they want to find their roosts in types of buildings, they like dark buildings. So dark farm buildings are the best type of roost they can find. Undisturbed largely during the evening. They can be busy during the day, but bats have got used to that kind of hustle and bustle of human lifestyle. As long as the roof space where the bats will find themselves in is largely undisturbed, is largely dark, draft free, then that will be perfect for bats. Some bats are more demanding than others. Some bats need a large fly space in the roof attic where they can warm up before they go out. Other bats just need a little entry point next to the roof apex, and then they just cluster right next to that, and then they just jump in and jump out. So as I said before, there are 10 different types of bats. They all have varying requirements of the loft space or the house, but in terms of bats, they like it dark. In terms of female bats, they like it dark and warm, because for each degree of warmth they get, the youngsters have got a 10% more chance of survival. So they actually like to live in above human accommodation, so you've got your farmhouse, humans are living downstairs, warm air rises into that loft, the bats like it in there. For females in particular, males and non-breeding bats, they like the more quieter, cooler farm buildings, the byres, the outbuildings, the sheds, all those types of spaces. So even corrugated iron Dutch barns, fantastic for warmth, and so small numbers of bats will be in there. But if you want the big roosts with lots of bats, then generally it's the warmer farm buildings. So bats don't nest like birds do, they roost. So buildings and old trees, buildings in particular, are absolutely critical for the survival of bats. So much so that the ecology of bats is fundamentally based around the fact that they all group together to give birth. So they have these big congregations of bats coming together to give birth, and those are known as maternity roosts. And 90 times out of 100, those will be in buildings. And in a farmed environment, you're looking at slate-clad roofs, wind and watertight, with very little light pollution. So they're very undisturbed, they're nice and dark, they provide those settled, quiet conditions that bats love, and gives them that stable temperature regime that they require. There's no two ways about it. The warmer the roof is, up to a point, the better the survival rate of the youngsters. So they'll actually aim for the buildings with humans in them. So heat coming up through the roof into the loft space gives those female bats in that maternity roost that higher survival rate. But in terms of individual males and non-breeding females, they'll go for outbuildings, byres, any type of stone structure that absorb the heat nicely without too much day-to-day disturbance of the loft space. Predominantly they're in the loft. They can be behind cladding along the walls depending on the direction of the sun, but predominantly you'll find them up in the loft. And in terms of looking out for bats, in terms of what can you do to enhance the structures of bats, well, just maintain them wind and watertight. If you haven't got that environment that you think is perfect for bats, then try to remove lighting from the buildings, try to minimize disturbance if you think bats are going into the loft space and you're currently using that building. If you've got the flexibility to use another building for farm machinery or storage of materials, and that's a luxury that you may or may not have, then think about using that as that secondary building as a substitute for the main one where the bats might be. So bats Europe-wide have suffered some of the most dramatic crashes of all species over the last 100 years. And as a result of that, the protection afforded to bats and their roosts is some of the highest in Europe. So much so that bats are known as European protected species, like otters and dolphins, for example. So on the face of it, that protection is fantastic because it helps safeguard the bats, but also can be seen as a constraint on people carrying out day-to-day operations in their house, such as loft repairs, or in their farm, such as moving machinery around and potentially disturbing bats. So while some people might see that as a constraint, and it can be, it's an opportunity to be celebrated. You've got bats and they're fantastically rare and important, help keep down a load of insect prey, but also the constraints are there to protect the bats and allow people to go about their day-to-day activities. So yes, if you have a bat roost, it does mean that you have to have a bit more bureaucracy involved. You have to follow the legal routes of carrying out the work that you want to do, but 95 times out of 100, you're going to be able to get what you want done. There will be sometimes situations where, say, you've got lots of bats, they're all pregnant or they've just given birth, and there's a wide variety of species in your loft space or in your building. There you're going to be more constrained, and there's no two ways about that. There will be more constraints on what you can do, but the law is there to help you and the bats. There's plenty of advice from NatureScot, there's plenty of guidance from NatureScot and from local bat groups and from farm advisors and other ecologists. There are plenty of people there to help you through that system and that situation so that we get the best positive outcomes for both humans and bats.
Farmland can provide the ideal habitat for bats. These mammals require foraging habitats and connect landscape features like hedgerows to aid in their commute throughout the landscape in the search for insects.
Bats are very much dependent on the habitats they find around themselves. As I said before, they're very much nocturnal species. They're designed, built around navigating around the dark, so they don't like too much light. They have used the landscape for tens of thousands of years, and they know to follow distinct corridors. So they like to follow watercourses, hedge lines, shelter belts. Those are their flyaway corridors, if you like, to help navigate themselves around the countryside. Very few species of bats like to fly over open fields. because they're more susceptible to predators like owls or birds of prey, but also there's not that many insects in an open environment like this. It's too windy often, there's not enough shelter. So most bats like to navigate themselves around the edges of places. A, they feel safer, and B, perhaps a bit more importantly, there's more shelter, more insects sheltering in those habitat types. The taller the structure, the taller the vertical structure, so from small material up to large trees, the different types of species of bush or tree or vegetation, that gives different insects different things to feed on at different times of the year, and that's going to suck bats in as well. So in terms of the habitat type, it all depends on the vegetation. The taller the vegetation, the more varied the vegetation. That's fantastic for insects. Similarly, or conversely, the more animals you have, the less. If you've got less vegetation, you've got more animals eating the vegetation, then you've got more dung, more insects off the dung. So cattle, sheep are also fantastic for bats. So if you think about the day shift, you've got swallows and house martins, swifts, they're all flying over the farmland, feeding over middens and watercourses, over hedge lines. It's exactly the same at night time when the day shift goes to bed, the night shift's arrived, they're looking for that prey. Where the prey is where the good quality habitat is. Lots of variety, as I say, open water, tall vegetation, animals that are dunging, fantastic. So it's that variety rotating throughout that spring to summer months, because that's when the bats are active and that's when the insects have to be there. So if you can provide a landscape within your farm that provides high quality numbers of insects, doesn't have to be high quality, high numbers of species, but that's great, but it does have to be high biomass of insects, then that's what the bats are after. The thing about the species diversity in terms of the prey, the insects, is that the more diversity of insects, be that beetles, midges, flies or moths, they're all going to attract different types of bats. So I mentioned in the south of Scotland you've got 10 different types of bats. They're all feeding on slightly different things. So again, the more diverse the prey is, the more diverse range of bats you're going to come in to feed on those insects. So habitat quality is the most important thing you can do for bats. In terms of improving habitat quality, then you've got riparian strips along watercourses. So if you can fence off the watercourses, allow field margins to establish, that's going to provide a lot of habitat for invertebrates. Some of the bats will actually land on the ground to eat the insects, such as Natura's bats. They'll do that. So you don't have to have typical bat habitat in your mind. What you have to have is lots of different varieties. So a nice fenced strip alongside a watercourse, tall vegetation, and then trees amongst that is going to be absolutely fantastic. Trees provide invertebrates for the bats, also provides a lot of shelter and shade for the watercourse, provides benefit for fish. The insects will fall into the water for fish, so fish and bats will benefit from that. In terms of hedgerows, where we've got lots of hedgerows in the faraway landscape, not so many around these margins. You can see these fence lines are unhedged. So a double row hedge would be fantastic. Lots of variety in terms of species of the hedge, so hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, dog rose and guelder rose. They're all good species that attract insects. They flower, they provide berries. The flowers attract the insects, fantastic for the bats. And then what you want to do is you want to manage that hedgerow in a staggered way. So don't all cut it every year. Ideally don't cut any of it any year, but sometimes I understand next to roads you have to do that. But ideally you want to allow it to grow, 8 foot, 12 foot tall over the course of 3 years perhaps, then cut it back. Don't cut it all the way back to the buds, but allow some buds to remain so that you've got some good regrowth. And then you've got that staggered habitat for bats. As I said before, the bats will navigate their way along the hedgerow if it's there. So if it's a small hedgerow, it's not going to provide much food, but it's still a good navigation route. If it's a tall hedgerow with plenty of species variety, plenty of structural variety, that's the ideal for bats. One of the key things that farmers and any landowner can do for bats is manage better or reinstate farm ponds. So this is one of the key habitats that have been lost, these so-called ghost ponds that were there, still visible on maps, still maybe visible on the ground, but have dried out. and that's that perfect situation. Bats need to drink, so open water. They'll often come to cattle troughs to drink water, so they want open water. And if you've got a large pond or even a small pond, plenty of insects hatching all through the year, the bats will be attracted to that for food and water. So you're looking at, the basic necessities. If you're a bat, what do you want? You want somewhere to drink, somewhere to eat, somewhere to roost, and a farm offers all those things. And without too much effort, farmers can do a lot to improve the quality of what they have. Habitat creation seems a bit of a strange thing to be looking at in terms of a farm. If the farm is predominantly there for food production, so habitat creation has to fit alongside what the farm is predominantly there for, which is food production, maybe water management. So farmers are being increasingly enticed to land sharing, and I think land sharing offers huge opportunities for biodiversity improvement. So by land sharing I mean more hedgerows, more shelter belts, small-scale woodland creation, especially native broadleaves. So using the native woodland creation as an example, if you can create small areas of native woodland in unproductive or marginally productive areas of farmland, plant your trees quite widely spaced. If you think about a bat, whilst it's not blind, its eyesight isn't great, so it's going to have to navigate by echolocation. So the more obstacles, tree trunks in the way, the harder it is to navigate through a landscape. The more tree trunks there are, the more trees there are on any given bit of land, the darker that woodland is, the less vegetation there is growing underneath it, the less insects there are. So you want a nice open grown woodland, wood pasture, traditional agricultural practice, or agroforestry with less densely spaced trees around you and sheep or cattle being able to graze underneath. That open canopy is perfect for bats. That said, you also want to have a kind of dark area of woodland where the more specialist bats, brown long-eared bats for instance, they like to hunt in more dense vegetation. So you're looking really to have, as in everything, a mixture of all different types of structure, species and density of planting. So if you can get away from the bog standard 2 meter spacings between trees, 3 meter spacings between trees, and move to 4, 5, 6, 7 meter spacing, not only going to get wider spaced trees, but your trees, instead of growing tall and straight, are going to have more structures in it, more natural ability to create holes and crevices that the bats in the fullness of time can roost in. So it's a kind of win-win situation there, having widely spaced trees. It's good for bats to feed in, but it's also great opportunities for those trees to develop over time into high quality bat roosts. I think there's 2 aspects to why bats are important and why people should pay more attention, especially on farmlands. I think bats are an indicator of a healthy environment, and the more bats you have, the more that demonstrates that your soils, your watercourses, your overall health of your vegetation must be good. So if you've got polluted water or your soil is compacted or waterlogged, you're not going to have the invertebrates coming out of the ground, the cockchafers and the beetles that certain bats feast on, the mayflies coming out of the water. You won't have enough midges. Who wants too many midges? But you won't have the midges. So the fact that you've got certain bats in one area, you've been out of a night time, you've seen those, and then you look around and you see other areas haven't got those bats, it might not indicate there's an issue with those areas, but it might do. So it gets you thinking about, what am I doing in that area of land where it's not favouring bats? So it's a kind of like a prompt. The presence of bats is a prompt to you to think, where I've got them, that shows that things are healthy. Where I don't have them, do I need to do anything differently in how I manage land? Or could I do something differently to encourage more bats? So that's a kind of, the bioindicator route. And the second aspect is, like, bats are just fantastic. When you see them out of an evening and they're flying by you, there's over 1,000 different species in the world. There's no other mammal that has that variety of different species. They eat everything you can think of, other birds, frogs, fish, fruit, insects only in this country, but they're designed to survive. They're designed to live in a wide range of habitat types. They live an extraordinarily long time for a small mammal. If you think of a bat, the average bat weighs the same as a pound coin. that bat might live 8 or 9 years. You know, the Germans call them flying mice. A mouse will live for 1 or 2 years at the most. So these are incredibly long-lived, incredibly social, very intelligent animals. And when you see them fly by you, they're just a miracle of nature. So being privileged enough to own and manage land, I think there's a kind of, not a moral prerogative, but there's a obligation. Is that the same thing? There's maybe the opportunity to think, okay, what can I do for something? How can I, you know, not just be a great land manager and be a great food producer and look after the land as a steward for the next generation, but what can I do here and now for these fantastic mammals? And by looking to enhance your land for bats, you'll do a lot for a wide range of other species as well. So it's not just the bats. Birds will benefit, other flowers, butterflies will benefit from the habitat management that you do for those bats. So the same way as they're a bioindicator for a healthy landscape, bats have this kind of trickle-down effect. If you manage positively for bats, a whole wide range of other species will benefit. So I think if you take those two things in combination, I think that's plenty good reason to start thinking about being more proactive in your management for bats.